Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
The one feminine energy he can't dominate or forget. This isn't about the loudest woman he ever loved. It isn't about the most beautiful one either. It's about the woman who quietly stopped trying to win him, and somehow became the one he couldn't stop carrying in his mind. Not because she chased him, not because she changed him overnight, but because for the first time, she left him alone with a version of himself he couldn't explain away. And that's a kind of memory that doesn't fade just because the relationship ends. There are women a man remembers because they were loud, because they argued, because they cried, because every goodbye turned into another conversation that lasted until 2 a.m. And then, there are women he remembers for reasons he can't even explain to himself. Not because they were mysterious. Not because they played games. Actually, that's usually the first thing people assume. Oh, she must have been hard to get. No. Sometimes she wasn't hard to get at all. She was just hard to predict. Not in the dramatic sense. In the painfully ordinary sense. You knew she cared. You knew she was there. But somehow she never seemed desperate to make you understand that. And that's where something inside him quietly started losing control. I didn't understand this for a long time. Honestly, I used to think men stayed obsessed with women who rejected them. That was the easy explanation. It's comforting, actually. Because then you can tell yourself it was about ego. About winning. About competition. But life keeps embarrassing simple explanations. Because sometimes the woman he can't stop thinking about wasn't the one who rejected him. She was the one he thought he'd already figured out. Until one day, he realized he hadn't. I've watched this happen. I've lived parts of it. Not from one side only. From both. And if I'm honest, sometimes I still catch myself replaying moments that never looked important when they happened. It wasn't some dramatic ending. No one threw dishes. Nobody blocked anyone. There wasn't even one final conversation worthy of a movie. Just a slow accumulation of small misunderstandings. The kind you barely notice while you're living them. Until months later they become the only thing you remember. I think that's what surprises people the most. We imagine relationships fall apart because of one giant mistake. Most don't. Most disappear quietly. One conversation where someone feels slightly less safe. One text answered a little later. One hug that's a little shorter than the last one. One joke that lands wrong. One apology that never comes. And somewhere inside all of that, someone slowly stops reaching. Not dramatically. Almost invisibly. The strange thing about many men is that they're incredibly good at reading reactions. A smile. Anger. Withdrawal. Jealousy. Silence that's obviously meant to punish. Those things make sense. They're familiar. They're measurable. They tell him where he stands. But every now and then, he meets a woman whose emotional world doesn't organize itself around his behavior. That doesn't mean she doesn't care. It means her emotional center exists somewhere other than his approval. And that's surprisingly difficult to understand if you've spent years believing every relationship follows the same rhythm. Because at first, he mistakes it for confidence, then indifference, then pride, then maybe emotional distance. His brain keeps trying to label it. Nothing quite fits. It's uncomfortable when you can't categorize someone. Our minds hate unfinished files. We want people to make sense. We want them to become predictable. That's how we feel safe. He doesn't even realize he's trying to do it. He asks questions that don't sound like questions. So, are you mad? No. You seem different. I'm just tired. You sure? Yeah. Simple conversation. Nothing remarkable. Except later that night. He keeps thinking about it. Because her answer didn't give him the emotional reaction he unconsciously expected. No reassurance. No emotional performance. No argument. Just, I'm tired. Maybe she really was. That's the funny part. Sometimes there isn't hidden meaning. Sometimes people mean exactly what they say. But when someone has spent years decoding emotional signals, simplicity almost feels suspicious. So he keeps searching for something underneath. And ironically, he creates complexity where none existed. I remember a friend telling me something years ago. He said, "I don't know what's wrong with her." I asked, "What happened?" He shrugged. "Nothing." "What do you mean nothing?" "I don't know. That's the problem." He laughed after saying it. But it wasn't really laughter. It sounded more like frustration disguised as confidence. Then he added something I'll probably never forget. "I almost wish she'd yell at me." At first that sounded ridiculous. Why would anyone want more conflict? Later I understood. Conflict gives certainty. Silence doesn't. Steady behavior doesn't. A person who isn't emotionally spinning around your reactions forces you to sit with your own. And that's much harder than people admit. Because eventually, there's nothing left to chase except your own thoughts. Have you ever noticed how strange the human mind is? You'll forget entire conversations. But remember one sentence forever. You'll forget birthdays. Forget anniversaries. Forget what restaurant you went to. But you'll remember standing in a grocery store, looking at the tea she always bought, and suddenly feeling something tighten in your chest for no logical reason. Not overwhelming grief. Just that strange pressure behind your ribs. Like your body remembered before your mind did. The body is inconvenient like that. It stores things your pride tries to throw away. And pride, especially masculine pride, can be incredibly creative. It says, "I've moved on." Meanwhile, he checks her profile. Doesn't like anything. Closes it. Puts the phone down. Walks into the kitchen. Comes back. Checks it again. Not because he plans to message her. Just to see. See what? He couldn't even answer that honestly. Maybe to make sure she hadn't forgotten him. Maybe to make sure she looked happy. Maybe hoping she didn't. Both possibilities hurt. That's the contradiction nobody likes admitting. Sometimes you genuinely want someone to be okay. Just not completely okay without you. Ugly thought. Very human thought. Most people won't say it out loud, but they recognize it the second someone else does. The woman he couldn't read wasn't necessarily emotionally stronger. She had doubts. She overthought. She probably cried in private. Maybe she stared at her own phone wondering why he suddenly felt distant. Maybe she almost reached out several times. Maybe she even blamed herself. We create these impossible stories where one person is perfectly secure and the other is emotionally lost. Life is rarely that clean. The difference wasn't that she never struggled. The difference was that eventually, she stopped making every feeling his responsibility to fix. That's such a small shift. Almost invisible. But psychologically, it changes everything. Because now he's standing in front of someone who still cares. Without constantly trying to convince him she does. And strangely, that feels less controllable. Not because she became cold. Not because she started playing games. Actually, she may have become softer. Quieter. More honest. She stopped arguing every misunderstanding to death. Stopped sending paragraphs explaining herself. Stopped needing every conversation to end with certainty. Not because she had all the answers. Because she was tired. Real tired. The kind of tired that doesn't announce itself. It just, let's go. Sometimes I wonder if that's the moment everything quietly changes. Not when she leaves. Not when he leaves. But when both people are sitting on opposite sides of the same silence. telling themselves completely different stories about what it means. He thinks, she's pulling away. She thinks, I'm exhausted. He thinks, if she cared, she'd say something. She thinks, I've already said it 100 different ways. Neither one is lying. Neither one is completely right. That's what makes it so painfully human. And maybe that's why the one feminine energy he can't dominate or forget has nothing to do with being untouchable. It has nothing to do with mystery. It has nothing to do with making him chase. It's much quieter than that. It's the woman who slowly stopped organizing her emotional world around whether he understood her. Not because she stopped loving him, but because somewhere along the way, she realized that constantly explaining herself wasn't bringing them any closer. And he didn't understand what he was losing. Not yet. At that point, all he noticed was that she had become harder to read. Months later, lying awake at 1:30 in the morning with his phone lighting up an otherwise dark room, he would finally ask himself the question he had avoided all along. Why do I still think about someone I was so sure I understood? He wouldn't have an answer. Not that night. Not for a long time. Because some people don't haunt you by leaving loudly. They haunt you by quietly refusing to become the version of them you thought you had figured out. There comes a point in some relationships that doesn't look important while it's happening. No breakup. No dramatic speech. No one storms out. It's just one person stops correcting the version of themselves that lives inside the other person's head. At first, it looks like they're giving up. Maybe they are. Or maybe they're just tired. There's a difference. A really painful one. I think we've all had that conversation. You know the one. You explain something about yourself. They misunderstand it. You explain it again. A little slower this time. Maybe with different words. Maybe softer. Maybe kinder. And somehow, they still hear something completely different. Not because they're a bad person. Not because they're trying to hurt you. They're listening through old fears. Old disappointments. Old expectations. They're answering someone who existed before you ever arrived. And after a while, you start wondering if they're even talking to you anymore. Or to someone they lost years ago. I remember hearing a woman say something once that stayed with me. She wasn't angry. She wasn't crying. She just looked empty. She said, I spent 2 years trying to convince him I wasn't the person he thought I was. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny. The kind of laugh people make when they're too tired to cry in public. I don't think he ever met me. That sentence bothered me for days. Because maybe that's one of the loneliest things that can happen between two people. Not being unloved. Being misread. There's a strange grief that comes from constantly being translated into someone else's fears. You say, I'm overwhelmed. They hear, you don't care anymore. You say, I need a quiet night. They hear, you're pushing me away. You forget to reply for 3 hours because work swallowed your day. They tell themselves, see, I knew I wasn't important. The facts barely matter anymore. The story has already been written. And once people become emotionally attached to a story, they start collecting evidence for it. Not because they're dishonest. Because human beings are terrifyingly good at proving themselves right. He wasn't trying to misunderstand her. At least, not consciously. He just kept fitting her into a shape that made emotional sense to him. Every delayed text meant distance. Every quiet evening meant withdrawal. Every disagreement meant she was changing. Sometimes, she really was just tired. There's something quietly heartbreaking about having ordinary human moods interpreted as relationship emergencies. You don't even realize how exhausting that becomes. Eventually, you stop explaining. Not because you've stopped caring. Because you're no longer sure explanations change anything. I think this is where people watching from the outside often get it wrong. They'll say, Communication is the answer. Usually. Until communication becomes repetition. There's a point where repeating yourself starts feeling like abandoning yourself. Imagine explaining your favorite color every single week. At some point, you'd stop. Not because your favorite color changed. Because you're exhausted by proving something that should already be known. Relationships can become like that. I wasn't upset. I already told you. I meant exactly what I said. No, that's not what I meant. Again. 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 Until one day, you answer with, okay. Just. Okay. It's such an ordinary word. For letters. Sometimes it's the loudest surrender in the world. He noticed the change. Of course he did. He just misunderstood it. He thought, she doesn't care enough to argue anymore. But that's rarely how it feels from the other side. From her side. It sounded more like this. If explaining myself hasn't helped after all this time, what exactly am I still fighting for? That's a dangerous question. Not because it ends relationships immediately. Because once someone genuinely asks it, something inside them starts loosening its grip. Very quietly. Very slowly. I've seen this happen more than once. The man notices she's calmer. Less reactive. Less emotional. He thinks things are finally improving. Meanwhile, she's simply running out of emotional energy. Those aren't the same thing. Sometimes peace isn't peace. Sometimes it's emotional fatigue wearing peaceful clothes. And fatigue has a very quiet voice. She still laughs. Still asks about his day. Still buys his favorite coffee. Still remembers his mother's birthday. From the outside, everything looks normal. Except, she has stopped hoping that this conversation will finally be the one where he sees her. Hope leaves before people do. That's one of the cruelest parts. One night they were sitting in the car after dinner. Nothing dramatic had happened. The restaurant had been nice. They laughed about something stupid. A waiter accidentally brought 2 desserts. For 20 minutes, everything felt easy. Then, on the drive home, he said something almost absent-mindedly. You always assume the worst. Silence. She looked out the passenger window. Streetlights slid across the glass every few seconds. Orange. Dark. Orange. Dark. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then simply said, okay. That was it. He thought she'd agreed. She hadn't. She had just decided not to begin another conversation that would somehow end with her defending a personality she didn't recognize. He kept driving. The radio was playing quietly. A song neither of them was really listening to. He remembers almost nothing about that drive now. Except one thing. She never looked back at him. Not once. It's strange what memory chooses to preserve. Months later, he couldn't remember what restaurant they ate at. Couldn't remember what they ordered. Couldn't remember the joke they'd laughed at. But he remembered her looking out that window. Why? Because something inside him knew that silence meant more than either of them admitted. He just didn't understand it yet. Human beings are funny. We often recognize emotional importance before we understand emotional meaning. Our bodies notice first. Our minds arrive months later. Sometimes years. There's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, he actually liked being the one who needed convincing. Not consciously. No one would admit that. But reassurance becomes addictive. Tell me you still love me. Tell me you're not leaving. Tell me we're okay. When someone keeps answering those questions, it becomes easy to ask them forever, without realizing you're asking them to carry all the emotional certainty in the relationship. Then one day, they stop. Not dramatically. Just. They answer less. Explain less. Defend themselves less. And suddenly the certainty disappears. That's when panic quietly enters the room. Not because she became colder, because now he has to generate reassurance inside himself. That's much harder. Internal dialogue. She just gave up. Did she? Well, she stopped explaining. How many times had she already explained? Maybe I just wanted one more explanation. Or maybe you wanted her to keep proving she wasn't leaving. That realization doesn't come all at once. It comes while brushing your teeth, driving to work, standing in line for coffee, doing laundry. Human regret is unbelievably inconvenient. It rarely arrives during dramatic moments. It shows up while folding socks, or buying toothpaste, or hearing someone laugh in a grocery store. One ordinary Tuesday, he opened an old conversation. Not because he intended to message her. He just wanted to check something. At least that's what he told himself. He scrolled upward. Further. Further. He found months of conversations. Paragraph after paragraph from her. Patient explanations. Gentle clarifications. Attempts to tell him what she needed. What she feared. What made her feel close. What made her feel invisible. He noticed something. Toward the end, the paragraphs became shorter. Then shorter. Then single sentences. Then reactions. Then almost nothing. He kept scrolling. His stomach tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough to make him stop. There it was. He could actually see hope disappearing. Not emotionally. Visually. Right there inside the messages. He whispered to himself. When did she stop talking? Then another voice answered before he wanted it to. She didn't stop talking. You stopped hearing. That hurt. Because it felt true. Or partly true. Truth is rarely complete. Maybe he had heard. Maybe he just didn't understand. Maybe he understood. And didn't know what to do with it. People are complicated. Fear makes ordinary people emotionally clumsy. Sometimes immature. Sometimes selfish. Sometimes frozen. Sometimes all three within the same week. That's what makes relationships so heartbreaking. Not villains. Just frightened people accidentally exhausting each other. By the time she stopped fighting for the story he was telling himself. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She wasn't trying to lose either. She was simply becoming unavailable for a role she had never auditioned for. The role of the woman who would spend forever convincing someone to see her clearly. And maybe that's why her silence stayed with him. Not because silence is powerful. Silence usually isn't. It's confusing. Awkward. Lonely. But this silence carried something different. It carried the weight of every explanation that had already been ignored. Long after the relationship ended, he would still catch himself replaying those conversations, trying to figure out the exact moment she stopped correcting him. As if finding that moment could somehow undo it. As if understanding it now could travel backward through time. It couldn't. Some realizations are painfully late. They arrive only after the person who needed to hear your understanding has stopped waiting for it. There is a moment that almost nobody talks about. Not because it's rare. Because it's embarrassing. Especially for men. It isn't the moment he realizes he's falling in love. It isn't the moment she leaves. It's the moment he realizes. He has no idea how to make her react anymore. At first, that sounds like a game. It isn't. At least not in healthy relationships. Most people don't wake up in the morning thinking, how can I control someone's emotions today? Human behavior is much quieter than that. Much more unconscious. We all do something similar. We smile to see someone smile back. We apologize hoping they'll soften. We pull away hoping they'll notice. We tell stories hoping someone laughs. We're constantly reaching into the emotional world of another person, trying to see whether we still matter there. It's one of the oldest instincts we have. We're wired to look for feedback, for confirmation, for signs that we're still emotionally connected. So when I say he wanted to win, I don't necessarily mean he wanted power over her. I mean something smaller, something much more ordinary. He wanted certainty. He wanted to know that his actions still had weight, that when he came closer, she noticed. When he became distant, she noticed. When he apologized, she softened. When he joked, she laughed. When he disappeared for a day, she wondered where he was. Not because he wanted to hurt her, because responses reassure us that we're emotionally significant. Most people don't realize how much of their confidence depends on someone else's predictable reactions. Until those reactions disappear, then something strange begins happening inside the nervous system. It doesn't feel like rejection. Not exactly. It feels like gravity stopped working. Imagine tossing a ball against a wall your entire life. Every time it comes back, you stop thinking about it. It's automatic. Then one day, you throw it again. Nothing comes back. No sound. No impact. Just silence. You stand there waiting, wondering if you somehow missed. That's what emotional uncertainty feels like. He had grown used to a rhythm between them. If he became distracted for a few days, she would eventually ask, "Everything okay?" If he sounded distant, she'd gently check in. If he canceled plans, she might be disappointed. None of these reactions were dramatic. They were simply proof that he still occupied emotional space inside her world. Then, something shifted. Not overnight. Nothing important ever changes overnight. She still answered. Still smiled. Still listened. But she stopped chasing clarity every time something felt off. The first time he noticed it, he barely registered it. He canceled dinner because work had run late. She replied, "No worries. Hope your day gets easier." That was it. No disappointment. No passive-aggressive comment. No. It's fine. No emotional undertone he could decode. Just kindness. Oddly enough, that unsettled him. Why? Because the script had changed. Human beings become attached to emotional scripts. Even unhealthy ones. Especially unhealthy ones. Conflict can become familiar. Familiar becomes comfortable. Comfortable becomes normal. So when someone quietly steps out of the script, everyone else feels lost. He told himself, "She's just in a good mood." Maybe. The next week he forgot to call. She didn't mention it. The following weekend he said he needed time alone. She smiled. "I get it." Again. Nothing. Now his mind became restless. Shouldn't she be upset? Did she stop caring? Is she pretending? Notice what happened. Nothing external had changed very much. The panic wasn't created by her behavior. It was created by uncertainty. Psychologists sometimes talk about prediction. Our brains constantly predict what comes next. That's how we move through life without exhausting ourselves. When people suddenly stop behaving the way we expect, the brain starts working overtime. That's why uncertainty feels physically uncomfortable. It's not only emotional. It's neurological. The mind hates unfinished equations. She had unknowingly become one. He found himself checking tiny things. How long did she take to reply? Was there less warmth in her messages? Did she use fewer emojis? Was that period at the end of the sentence intentional? Ridiculous questions. Completely human questions. It's amazing how intelligent people become amateur detectives the moment uncertainty enters their relationships. He reread messages searching for clues. She reread them too. The difference was, they were looking for different things. He searched for evidence she still wanted him. She searched for evidence he finally understood her. Neither found what they were looking for. Sometimes people miss each other while standing in the exact same emotional room. There's another misunderstanding that happens here. People assume calmness equals emotional detachment. Not always. Sometimes calmness is simply someone who has stopped negotiating reality. Think about it. Imagine telling someone for months, "This hurts me." They nod. Things improve for a week. Then everything repeats. Eventually, you stop delivering speeches. Not because the hurt disappeared, because repeating it feels heavier than carrying it alone. That's what happened to her. Her calmness wasn't emotional superiority. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't some secret feminine strategy. It was acceptance. Not acceptance that everything was okay. Acceptance that she could no longer force another person to understand what they weren't ready to see. That's an exhausting realization. It doesn't feel empowering. It feels lonely. One evening they were walking through a bookstore. He wandered toward the history section. She drifted into fiction. Normally she would have called him over. "Come look at this." Or handed him a book she'd found interesting. This time, she simply smiled to herself and kept browsing. 10 minutes later, he noticed something strange. She seemed completely fine being alone. Not abandoned. Not disconnected. Just comfortable. He stood there pretending to read the back of a book. Instead, he watched her. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't checking whether he was watching. She wasn't trying to include him every 30 seconds. She looked peaceful. The feeling that rose inside him wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was something harder to name. Irrelevance. For a brief moment, he wondered whether she actually needed him there. That thought frightened him far more than he expected. We don't often admit this, but many relationships quietly become organized around being needed. Needed feels safe. Needed feels permanent. Needed feels important. Being wanted is different. Wanting is free. Need feels secure. Freedom feels uncertain. When someone stops clinging, it forces you to ask a terrifying question. Would they still choose me? Not because they have to, because they genuinely want to. That's a much riskier question. And maybe that's why so many people unconsciously create situations where their partner keeps proving their devotion. Not out of cruelty. Out of fear. Fear whispers strange things. If they stop chasing me, maybe they'll leave. If they stop asking, maybe they've stopped loving. If they stop needing reassurance, maybe they don't need me. Fear almost always mistakes emotional independence for emotional distance. He started testing reality without realizing it. Nothing dramatic. Tiny things. Waiting longer to text. Seeing if she'd message first. Changing plans. Being slightly unavailable. These weren't calculated games. More like nervous system experiments. His brain wanted data. Do I still matter? Sometimes she'd text. Sometimes she wouldn't. Not because she was playing games. Because she'd stopped measuring the relationship through constant pursuit. Ironically, that made him pursue internally. His body began asking questions his ego refused to ask aloud. One night he woke up around 3 a.m. No obvious reason. Just awake. He reached for water. Looked at his phone. No messages. He stared at the ceiling. An odd thought appeared. I don't know what she's thinking anymore. Then another one. Did I ever? He turned onto his side. Closed his eyes. Opened them again. Sleep wouldn't come back. Because uncertainty has a way of keeping the nervous system slightly activated. Not enough to panic. Just enough that your body never fully relaxes. People imagine emotional awakening as dramatic. It's usually much smaller. It's lying awake because someone no longer reacts the way they used to. It's realizing you've spent weeks trying to provoke certainty without admitting that's what you're doing. It's recognizing that your confidence depended more on predictability than love. That realization is uncomfortable. Almost humiliating. Because suddenly, you see yourself from the outside. Checking your phone. Watching for reactions. feeling disappointed when someone responds with mature understanding instead of emotional chaos. Who wants to admit that? Nobody. But that's exactly why it matters. Because healing often begins the moment we become honest about the parts of ourselves that don't look very noble. He wasn't evil. He wasn't controlling. He was scared. Scared that her steadiness meant she no longer needed him. Scared that her quiet confidence left him with nowhere to hide. Scared that if she wasn't emotionally revolving around him anymore, he would finally have to ask whether he had been truly showing up for her at all. That's the question he'd avoided for months. Maybe longer. The strange thing about not being able to win wasn't that she suddenly became impossible. It was that she quietly stopped participating in a game neither of them realized they had been playing. The game where one person's emotional reactions became proof of the other's value. Once she stepped out of it, there was nothing left for him to conquer. Only himself. And for many people, that turns out to be the hardest relationship they'll ever have. People imagine heartbreak as something dramatic. A wedding photo hidden in a drawer. A favorite song that suddenly becomes unbearable. A tearful goodbye at an airport. Sometimes those things happen, but they're not always what stays. The truth is, our brains are strangely selective. When someone leaves, we expect to remember the biggest moments. Instead, we remember the smallest ones. The way she tucked loose hair behind her ear while reading a menu. The tiny wrinkle between her eyebrows whenever she concentrated. How she always warmed her hands around a coffee cup before taking the first sip. None of these memories seem important. Until they're all that's left. I've always found that fascinating. The human brain doesn't archive relationships like a movie. It stores them like scattered photographs. Completely out of order. One random smell. One ordinary sentence. One afternoon light coming through a kitchen window. Years later, those fragments remain untouched. Long after the important conversations disappear. He couldn't remember exactly why they broke apart. Not anymore. If someone had asked him 6 months later, "So, what happened?" he probably would have given a reasonable explanation. We wanted different things. The timing wasn't right. We stopped communicating. All of those answers would have been partly true. None of them would have explained why he suddenly felt empty every time he walked past the bakery 2 blocks from his office. She loved cinnamon rolls. Not even in a dramatic way. She just always bought one on rainy mornings. Now every rainy morning. His chest tightened before his mind understood why. That's the strange thing about memory. The body remembers first. Logic arrives later. Sometimes much later. Scientists often talk about emotional encoding. Experiences connected to emotion are stored differently than ordinary information. Maybe that's why we can forget someone's birthday, yet remember exactly how they laughed while trying to assemble cheap furniture together 4 years ago. Love doesn't organize memory. Emotion does. And emotion is wonderfully irrational. One afternoon, he was standing in a grocery store. Nothing special. He only needed toothpaste and laundry detergent. He turned into the tea aisle. Without thinking, he reached for the same jasmine tea she'd always bought. His hand froze halfway there. He stared at the box, almost annoyed with himself. "I don't even drink jasmine tea." No, he didn't. She did. Yet somehow, his brain had quietly incorporated her habits into its map of ordinary life. Nobody prepares you for that. People tell you heartbreak hurts. They don't tell you your shopping list changes, or that your apartment feels strangely organized around someone who no longer lives there. He still found himself buying 2 avocados, even though one would eventually go bad. She used to eat the other one. His brain hadn't updated yet. It's amazing how slowly routine accepts reality. I remember speaking to a man once whose marriage had ended nearly 3 years earlier. He told me something so ordinary it almost broke my heart. He said, "I still turn the bathroom light on before I leave for work. I asked why. He smiled. My wife hated walking into a dark bathroom in the morning. Then he paused. I live alone. That silence said more than any dramatic love story ever could. Because grief often hides inside habits. Not tears. Habits. The problem with small memories is that they're impossible to predict. You can prepare yourself for birthdays, anniversaries, Valentine's Day. You expect those to hurt. Nobody prepares for hearing someone laugh exactly the way she used to, or passing a stranger wearing the same perfume, or noticing someone sitting cross-legged in a cafe exactly the way she always did. Tiny things become emotional ambushes. They don't ask permission. They simply arrive. 1 minute you're thinking about work. The next, you're standing completely still because someone in front of you ordered an oat milk latte. She always ordered oat milk. That's it. Nothing profound. Yet suddenly, your nervous system behaves as though time has folded in half. You're not in today's coffee shop anymore. You're back in that tiny cafe where she teased you for pretending to like espresso. Memory doesn't ask whether it's convenient. It only asks whether something once mattered. What surprised him wasn't that he remembered her. It was what he remembered. Not their anniversary. Not their first kiss. Not the day they met. Instead, he remembered that she always peeled the paper sleeve off disposable coffee cups. Every single time. Without realizing it. She'd roll the cardboard between her fingers while talking. One afternoon, he noticed another woman doing exactly the same thing. His stomach dropped. For one impossible second. His brain believed she had walked back into his life. Then the woman looked up. Wrong face. Wrong voice. Wrong person. He laughed at himself. Quietly. Embarrassed. But underneath the embarrassment, there was sadness. Not because he wanted every stranger to be her. Because he'd forgotten how deeply the mind connects tiny behaviors with specific people. That's how attachment works. Not through grand gestures. Through repetition. Thousands of ordinary repetitions. Psychologists sometimes call them emotional associations. I think of them as invisible threads. Each tiny shared routine becomes another thread. Watching the same TV show on Sunday nights. Arguing over which side of the bed belongs to whom. Stealing fries off each other's plate. Sending random pictures of dogs during lunch breaks. None of those moments feel historic. Until they stop happening. Then suddenly, they're everywhere. He once opened his phone to send her a picture of an unusually shaped cloud. His thumb had already reached her conversation before his mind caught up. He stared at the screen. There it was. Her name. Still pinned near the top. His finger hovered. Then stopped. He locked the phone instead. Not because he didn't want to talk. Because he realized his instinct still believed she was the first person he wanted to share small things with. That realization hurt more than loneliness. Loneliness says, I miss someone. Instinct says, my life still expects them to exist. Those are different kinds of pain. People often assume moving on means forgetting. I don't think that's true. The brain isn't built to erase. It's built to adapt. Slowly. Sometimes painfully slowly. The memories don't disappear. They simply stop demanding attention. At first, every reminder feels enormous. Months later, they become quieter. Not gone. Just quieter. Like hearing music from another apartment. You know it's there. You don't stop your whole day because of it anymore. Still, certain memories refuse to fade. Not because they're the happiest. Because they remain unfinished. He couldn't stop remembering one particular Tuesday. Not because anything extraordinary happened. Actually, almost nothing happened. They had grocery shopped together. Cooked pasta. Watched half of a documentary before falling asleep on opposite ends of the couch. If someone had filmed that evening, Nobody would have called it romantic. It would have looked almost boring. Yet years later, that was the night he missed the most. Why? Because it represented something people rarely appreciate while they still have it. Ordinary peace. Not excitement. Not passion. Not fireworks. Peace. The kind of peace where silence doesn't need fixing. Where two people can exist in the same room doing different things without questioning whether love is still there. That's much rarer than people realize. We celebrate dramatic romance. But our nervous systems quietly fall in love with predictability. The way someone says, "I'm stopping by the store." The sound of keys in the front door at 6:30. Their shoes left beside yours. Their half-finished glass of water on the nightstand. Routine is one of love's least glamorous languages. It's also one of its deepest. When routine disappears, the absence echoes much louder than people expect. One evening, he finally decided to reorganize the apartment. Not because he suddenly felt healed. Because he couldn't keep living inside a museum. He moved books. Packed away photographs. Changed the furniture around. For a few hours. It actually felt productive. Like progress. Then he opened the kitchen drawer. Inside was a rubber band. Blue. Completely ordinary. He picked it up. Immediately remembered. She used to wrap it around bags of spinach because the original twist ties always broke. He stood there, holding a rubber band. Laughing. Then crying. Then laughing again because crying over a rubber band felt ridiculous. That's grief. Ridiculous. Beautiful. Humiliating. Profound. All at the same time. People imagine that love lives inside declarations. I'll always love you. I'll never leave. Maybe. But I think real love quietly settles somewhere else. Inside automatic behaviors. Inside tiny observations. Inside details nobody intentionally memorizes. You don't consciously decide to remember the exact rhythm of someone's footsteps in the hallway. Your nervous system does it for you. Without asking. Without announcing itself. And perhaps that's why she became so difficult to forget. Not because she was louder than everyone else. Not because she was more beautiful. Not because she was perfect. She simply occupied thousands of invisible places inside his everyday life. Places neither of them noticed while they were still together. The tragedy wasn't that he remembered her. The tragedy was when he finally understood what those memories were trying to tell him. They weren't asking him to go back. They weren't asking him to chase her. They were quietly revealing something he hadn't fully understood while she was still beside him. Love is rarely built in extraordinary moments. It's built in ordinary ones repeated often enough that they become part of who you are. And by the time he realized that, those ordinary moments had already become memories his brain refused to let go of. One of the biggest misunderstandings about relationships is the word space. People use it all the time. I just need some space. I need time to think. I need room to breathe. Sometimes those words are honest. Sometimes they're necessary. Healthy relationships absolutely require individuality. No one can stay emotionally regulated if they never have time to hear their own thoughts. But there is another version of space. A quieter one. The kind people ask for when they don't know how to explain what they're feeling. Not because they want to leave. Because closeness has started activating something inside them they don't understand. Maybe pressure. Maybe fear. Maybe old wounds. Maybe responsibility. Whatever it is. Distance temporarily feels easier than intimacy. At least in the beginning. That's the part almost everyone understands. The part fewer people talk about is what happens after the distance finally arrives. Because silence rarely stays empty. It begins filling itself. When he asked for space, he wasn't imagining an ending. He pictured something much simpler. A few quiet days. Time to clear his head. Less emotional intensity. Less expectation. Maybe fewer conversations about where things were going. He imagined relief. His nervous system had been overloaded. Work was stressful. Life felt crowded. Even love, somehow, had started feeling like another responsibility. Not because she demanded too much. Because he no longer knew how to carry everything at once. So one evening he looked at her and said softly, "I just need a little space." She didn't argue. She nodded. "If that's what you need." Her voice wasn't cold. Just tired. He noticed it. Then immediately looked away. There are moments when we instinctively avoid someone's eyes because somewhere inside us, we already know they're understanding something we aren't ready to face. The first 24 hours felt exactly as he'd expected. Quiet. His phone buzzed less. No conversations to navigate. No emotional decisions waiting after work. He watched television longer than usual. Ordered takeout. Stayed awake until 2 in the morning. At first, the silence felt like freedom. Freedom has a very specific sensation. Your shoulders drop. Your breathing slows. The constant awareness of another person's emotional world fades into the background. For a while, that can feel incredibly comforting, especially if you've been emotionally overwhelmed. But relief and healing aren't the same thing. People often confuse them. Relief happens immediately. Healing reveals itself much later. The second day felt different. Not bad. Just strange. He reached for his phone during lunch. No message. Normally she'd send something small. A picture of a dog she'd seen. A funny typo. A question about dinner. Nothing. He reminded himself. Well, I asked for space. Of course she wasn't texting. Still. He checked again an hour later. Then again before bed. Nothing. His logical mind understood exactly why. His emotional mind didn't. This is where something fascinating begins happening inside the human brain. We often imagine silence as the absence of information. It isn't. Silence is one of the loudest forms of communication we experience. Because when external information disappears, the brain starts generating its own. Psychologists sometimes call this filling in the gaps. The mind hates uncertainty. When reality provides no answers, imagination volunteers. At first, his imagination remained practical. She's probably giving me what I asked for. Then, maybe she's upset. A little later, maybe she's spending time with friends. Eventually, maybe she's realizing life feels easier without me. Notice how quickly uncertainty becomes storytelling. Nothing had actually happened. His brain simply refused to tolerate an unanswered question. The strange thing about silence is that it acts like an empty room. Whatever you're carrying emotionally echoes louder inside it. Before the space, he thought the problem was the relationship. Inside the silence, he slowly realized much of the noise had been coming from inside himself. Without their daily conversations, he finally had uninterrupted access to his own thoughts. At first, he didn't enjoy that nearly as much as he'd imagined. He drove home from work one evening. Normally, he'd call her halfway through the commute. Not to discuss anything important. Just to hear another voice. This time, he drove in complete silence. At the third red light, he instinctively reached for the call button. Stopped himself. Dropped his hand back onto the steering wheel. The car suddenly felt much larger than usual. It's amazing how quickly another person's presence becomes part of our internal landscape. Even when they're not physically there. Especially then. The following Saturday, he cleaned his apartment. Laundry. Vacuuming. Dishes. Every task finished earlier than expected. He looked around. The apartment was spotless. There was absolutely nothing left to do. He realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't actually wanted free time. He had wanted relief from emotional confusion. Those aren't the same thing. One can exist without the other. That's when silence started changing shape. It stopped feeling like rest. It started feeling like reflection. Not because he intentionally began analyzing the relationship, because there were finally no distractions left. The conversations he'd avoided began replaying on their own. Not the arguments. Those faded surprisingly quickly. Instead, he remembered the pauses between the arguments. The moments she'd quietly looked disappointed before saying, "It's okay." He remembered how often she'd asked, "Can we talk later?" Not because she wanted conflict, because she wanted understanding. Back then, those conversations felt exhausting. Now, they sounded different. Distance has a peculiar way of removing defensiveness. Without someone standing in front of us, we stop preparing our next response. For the first time, he heard what she'd actually been trying to say. Not the words, the feeling underneath them. She hadn't been criticizing him. She'd been trying to stay emotionally connected. He'd experienced connection as pressure. She'd experienced withdrawal as loneliness. Neither of them had been trying to hurt the other. They'd simply translated the same reality into different emotional languages. One afternoon, he opened an old voice message. She'd sent it months earlier. It wasn't romantic. She was laughing because she'd accidentally burned garlic bread. Between laughs, she said, "I swear I'm better at cooking than this." He smiled, then listened again. Not because of the story, because of the sound of her laughing without self-consciousness. There was something painfully alive about it. He realized he hadn't heard that version of her in a long time. When had it disappeared? He couldn't remember. That bothered him. People often notice when relationships become unhappy. They rarely notice the gradual disappearance of joy. Joy doesn't usually leave in one dramatic moment. It leaves quietly. One unspoken disappointment at a time. One unresolved conversation at a time. Until eventually, someone who used to laugh easily starts smiling politely instead. Silence also did something unexpected. It removed the illusion of control. When they spoke every day, he unconsciously believed the relationship remained within reach. If something went wrong, they could always talk tomorrow. Tomorrow became another tomorrow. Then another. Now there was no tomorrow scheduled. No casual conversation waiting. No guaranteed opportunity to fix anything. For the first time, he experienced the relationship as something that could genuinely become part of his past. That realization changed everything. Not because she had officially left, because possibility had entered the room. The possibility that life keeps moving whether you're emotionally ready or not. One evening, he walked through a neighborhood park. Children played soccer. An older couple fed ducks by the pond. A young woman sat alone reading a novel beneath a tree. Completely ordinary. Yet he suddenly noticed something. Everyone else seemed fully present. His own mind remained somewhere else entirely. Not with her exactly. With the version of himself who'd existed before asking for space. He started wondering whether he'd mistaken emotional avoidance for independence. There's a difference. Independence says, "I can be close to you without losing myself." Avoidance says, "I need distance before I can breathe." Those two experiences can feel almost identical from the inside. Until enough time passes. Then one creates peace. The other creates regret. Of course, not everyone who asks for space regrets it. Some relationships truly need distance. Some relationships end because they should. This isn't a story about staying together no matter what. It's a story about discovering what silence reveals. Sometimes silence confirms your decision. Sometimes it exposes it. His silence exposed him. It showed him how often he'd mistaken emotional discomfort for incompatibility. How often he'd assumed difficult conversations meant something was wrong with the relationship, when perhaps they simply meant two imperfect people were trying to understand each other. One night, nearly 2 weeks after asking for space, his phone lit up. A message. Not from her. Someone else. For a split second. His heart had already decided who it wanted it to be. That startled him. Because he hadn't admitted it to himself yet. Not consciously. His body admitted it first. Bodies are honest that way. Long before pride catches up. Long before language does. He sat on the edge of his bed staring into the darkness. No television. No music. Just quiet. He whispered something almost no one was there to hear. I thought I wanted silence. Then, after several long seconds, he corrected himself. No. I wanted less noise inside me. Those are profoundly different wishes. Silence had never been the solution. Silence had simply removed enough distractions for him to finally hear the conversation he'd been avoiding all along. Not the one with her. The one with himself. Because sometimes the loudest voice in an empty room isn't loneliness. It's truth. And truth has an unusual habit. It waits patiently. It never competes for attention. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't argue. It simply sits quietly beside you until the world becomes still enough that you can no longer pretend not to hear it. That was the real reason the silence started talking. Not because she disappeared, but because, in her absence, every feeling he had managed to outrun while she was present finally caught up with him. And for the first time since asking for space, he understood that distance doesn't always separate you from another person. Sometimes, it removes every distraction standing between you and yourself. There comes a moment in some relationships that almost no one notices while it's happening. There isn't a dramatic goodbye. No slammed doors. No final speech. Nothing you could point to and say, that was the moment everything changed. Instead, one person quietly stops running. And strangely, that's when the other person finally starts moving. It's one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human relationships. People often assume that if someone stops reaching out, they must care less. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes, they've simply reached the end of their emotional endurance. There's an important difference between giving up and no longer chasing. Giving up comes from hopelessness. Not chasing often comes from acceptance. Acceptance has a different energy. It's quieter, less dramatic, almost peaceful. From the outside, those two things can look identical. From the inside, they feel completely different. When she stopped chasing him, she didn't make an announcement. She didn't block his number. She didn't post cryptic quotes online. She didn't suddenly become cold. She simply stopped interrupting his distance. And that changed everything. For months, their relationship had followed an invisible rhythm. She reached. He pulled away. She tried to understand. He needed more time. She initiated conversations. He promised they'd talk later. Without realizing it, they had created a pattern. Not because either of them wanted one. Because nervous systems love familiarity. Even unhealthy familiarity. Psychologists sometimes describe relationships as dances. I think that's the perfect metaphor. A dance isn't controlled by one person. Every movement creates the next. If one person steps backward, the other instinctively adjusts. Most couples never notice the choreography they've built together. Until one person suddenly changes the steps. That's exactly what happened. One Tuesday evening he looked at his phone. Normally around 7 o'clock. She would text. Nothing complicated. Just, how was your day? Or maybe, don't forget your jacket. It might rain. Little things. Tiny bridges between two separate lives. That Tuesday, nothing arrived. He barely noticed. Wednesday came. Still nothing. Thursday. He looked at his phone twice before realizing what he was waiting for. It surprised him. Not because she hadn't texted. Because he'd expected her to. Expectation is one of the strongest emotional forces we have. The brain quietly builds predictions about the people we love. She'll call after work. He'll kiss me goodbye. She'll ask if I've eaten. These predictions become invisible. Until one day, they don't happen. Then suddenly, our attention locks onto the absence. Not the event. The absence. It's fascinating how rarely we appreciate consistency while it's happening. We only notice it after it disappears. The first week, he assumed she was simply respecting the space he'd asked for. The second week, he began checking whether she'd viewed his social media stories. Not because he planned to message her. Just curiosity. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Curiosity is often grief wearing a more acceptable outfit. He noticed she hadn't reacted. No likes. No comments. No subtle signs she was still watching. Something unexpectedly heavy settled inside his chest. For months, he had unconsciously relied on tiny reminders that he still occupied space in her emotional world. Not conversations. Evidence. Now, the evidence had disappeared. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing someone has stopped orbiting around you, especially if you've never questioned whether they would. He remembered a conversation from nearly a year earlier. She'd smiled and said, "I feel like I'm always the one reaching for you." He had answered quickly, "That's not true." He believed it, at least at the time. Memory is interesting that way. We often remember our intentions more clearly than our behaviors. He intended to love her. He intended to make time. He intended to reassure her. But intention isn't what another person experiences. Behavior is. Looking back, he realized she hadn't been criticizing him. She'd been describing her reality. There is a subtle form of emotional exhaustion that doesn't look like anger. It looks like becoming quieter. People imagine emotional burnout as crying, begging, exploding. Often, it looks like someone no longer asking for what they once desperately needed. Not because they stopped needing it, because asking became more painful than going without. One afternoon, he opened their old conversation thread. He wasn't searching for anything specific, just scrolling. At first, he noticed the obvious things: vacation photos, birthday wishes, funny memes. Then something else caught his attention. The pattern. Again and again. She started the conversations. "Good morning. How did your meeting go? Made it home. Thinking of you." He had always answered. Sometimes warmly. Sometimes hours later. Sometimes not until the next morning. He suddenly wondered something he'd never asked himself before. How many times had she waited for a message that never came? Not because he didn't care. Because he assumed there would always be another opportunity. The dangerous thing about love is that consistency creates the illusion of permanence. We confuse repeated behavior with guaranteed behavior. We begin believing someone will always keep trying. Until they don't. And by then, our nervous system has become dependent on efforts we barely noticed while they were happening. One evening, he ran into a mutual friend. Casual conversation. Nothing unusual. Eventually, the friend mentioned her. "She seems good." Just 4 simple words. "She seems good." He smiled politely. "That's nice." The conversation moved on. But his mind didn't. "She seems good." He repeated the sentence all the way home. Not because he wanted her to suffer. He didn't. He genuinely wanted her happiness. At least, part of him did. Another quieter part felt strangely displaced. If she was okay, what role did he still occupy inside her story? That's an uncomfortable question. One many people never admit out loud. We don't necessarily want someone to stay miserable. But there's a vulnerable part of the human heart that hopes we still matter. Not through guilt, through significance. The possibility that she could continue living. laughing, healing, without needing him, forced him to confront something unexpected. He hadn't feared losing her attention. He'd feared becoming emotionally replaceable. Notice the difference. Attention feeds the ego. Significance touches identity. When someone has loved us deeply, we quietly assume we'll always remain emotionally important to them, even after separation. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes their healing simply continues without announcing itself. Healing is often invisible. That's why it surprises people. She wasn't pretending not to care. She was learning how to carry her life without constantly reaching toward someone who couldn't meet her where she stood. There's a quiet dignity in that. Not dramatic strength. Just dignity. He began noticing other changes. Her profile picture stayed the same for weeks. No emotional posts. No indirect messages. No attempts to make him jealous. Nothing. Some people mistake silence for manipulation. This wasn't that. Manipulation wants to be noticed. Peace doesn't. One Saturday morning he found himself standing outside a bookstore they used to visit together. Almost automatically. He looked through the window, half expecting to see her. She wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. Still, his heart had checked before his mind did. He laughed softly, then walked inside anyway. He wandered through the aisles. History, psychology, travel. Eventually he reached the fiction section. She used to disappear there for nearly an hour. Always saying, 5 more minutes. It was never 5 minutes. He smiled at the memory. Then something unexpected happened. He realized he no longer knew what books she liked. Not now. He knew the woman she'd been a year ago. But life had continued. She had continued. People often freeze someone in memory. Reality never does. While he had been replaying old conversations, she had probably discovered new favorite songs, met new people, developed new routines, read books he'd never hear about. That realization felt strangely intimate. Not because it hurt, because it reminded him that every person keeps becoming someone new, even after they leave our lives. One night he almost sent a message. Nothing dramatic. Just, hope you're doing okay. He typed it, read it, deleted it. Not because he didn't care. Because for the first time, he questioned his own motivation. Was he reaching out for her? Or for relief? Sometimes we don't miss the relationship. We miss ending the uncertainty inside ourselves. He put the phone down, sat quietly, thought about something she'd once said during an argument. I don't want to convince you to choose me. Back then, he barely understood what she meant. Now, he finally did. Love offered under pressure doesn't feel like love. It feels like negotiation. She had eventually stopped negotiating. Not because she stopped loving him. Because she started respecting herself. That distinction changed the entire story. The irony is almost painful. While she was chasing him, his attention stayed focused on creating distance. Once she stopped chasing, his attention naturally turned toward her. Not because she became more valuable overnight. Because the emotional system they had unconsciously built no longer existed. The chase had ended. Without realizing it, he had depended on being pursued. Not out of arrogance. Out of familiarity. Once that familiar rhythm disappeared, his own nervous system began searching for the missing movement. Just as dancers stumble when their partner unexpectedly changes direction. He found himself emotionally reaching toward someone he'd spent months stepping away from. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't karma. It was psychology. Human beings often become most aware of emotional safety only after its constant presence quietly disappears. One rainy evening, he finally admitted something to himself. Not out loud. Just internally. For months, he had believed she was chasing him. Now he realized something far more honest. She hadn't been chasing him. She had been carrying the relationship. There is an enormous difference. One is pursuit. The other is effort. One eventually becomes exhausting. The other often goes unnoticed until it stops. And perhaps that's why her absence suddenly occupied so much space inside his mind. Because when she stopped chasing, she also stopped compensating for the distance between them. For the first time, he had to experience that distance exactly as she had, without someone constantly building bridges across it. And in that silence, he finally understood something that had been true all along. The person who appears to be running after love isn't always the one who needs it more. Sometimes, they're simply the only one still willing to do the work of keeping two hearts connected. The day she stopped doing that, his mind quietly began walking the road she had traveled alone for far longer than he had ever realized. Perhaps the most lasting impact another person can have on our lives isn't that they change who we are. It's that they reveal a version of us we didn't know existed. Most relationships don't simply introduce us to another person. They introduce us to ourselves. Not the carefully managed version. Not the one we present at work. Not the confident version our friends recognize. But the quieter self that only appears when intimacy removes the need to perform. That's why some people remain unforgettable long after the relationship ends. They didn't just witness parts of us. They illuminated them. And once you've seen yourself through that kind of light, it's almost impossible to return to not knowing. When he first met her, he believed he understood exactly who he was. Independent. Rational. Easygoing. Someone who didn't need constant reassurance. Someone who valued freedom. Those descriptions weren't lies. They simply weren't complete. Most of us build our identity from situations we've already survived. I work well under pressure. I'm not an emotional person. I don't get jealous. I don't need anyone. Until life quietly introduces circumstances that test assumptions we've never questioned. Relationships do that more than almost anything else. Not because love changes your personality overnight. Because closeness exposes emotional habits that distance keeps hidden. In the beginning, she often described him as calm. I like how steady you are. He smiled every time she said it. He believed it too. Then one evening she canceled dinner because her younger sister needed help moving apartments. His response surprised both of them. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse her. He simply became different. Shorter replies. Less warmth. A subtle emotional withdrawal. When she finally asked, "Are you upset?" he answered immediately. No. Technically. He wasn't lying. He wasn't consciously angry. He simply didn't understand what he was feeling. Many people mistake emotional suppression for emotional regulation. They're very different experiences. Regulation says, I feel disappointed, but I can stay connected. Suppression says, I don't know what I'm feeling, so I'll disappear until it goes away. From the outside, those two behaviors can look almost identical. Inside the nervous system, they're worlds apart. She noticed patterns long before he did. Whenever he felt uncertain, he became quieter. Whenever he felt hurt, he became logical. Whenever he felt vulnerable, he became busy. He thought he was protecting the relationship from unnecessary conflict. She experienced something entirely different. She experienced emotional distance arriving precisely when closeness was needed most. Neither interpretation was malicious. They simply occupied different realities. One rainy afternoon, they were assembling a bookshelf she'd ordered online. The instructions made very little sense. Halfway through, they realized one entire shelf had been installed upside down. She burst into laughter. He stared at the crooked bookshelf for several seconds. Then laughed too. They spent another hour taking everything apart and rebuilding it correctly. Months later, after the relationship had ended, That afternoon returned to him unexpectedly. Not because of the bookshelf. Because of who he'd been. Relaxed. Playful. Patient. He barely recognized that version of himself anymore. Where had that man gone? More importantly, when had he started disappearing? People often believe personality is fixed. In reality, different relationships activate different emotional states. Around one person, you become curious. Around another, you become defensive. Around someone else, you become deeply generous. None of those versions are fake. They're different possibilities already living inside you. Certain people simply unlock certain rooms. She had accidentally opened rooms inside him he hadn't entered in years. Not because she possessed magical qualities. Because she consistently responded to parts of him that most people never saw. She loved his terrible jokes. She noticed when he looked overwhelmed before he admitted it. She celebrated tiny accomplishments that everyone else ignored. One day he came home after finally resolving a frustrating problem at work. To everyone else, it was an ordinary Tuesday. She had bought his favorite dessert. Not because it was a major achievement. Because she knew how much mental energy it had required. "You looked exhausted this morning," she said. "I figured today deserved cheesecake." He laughed. "That's oddly specific." "I pay attention." 3 simple words. I pay attention. At the time, they felt ordinary. Afterward, they became unforgettable. Because attention is one of the purest expressions of affection. Not expensive gifts. Not dramatic declarations. Attention. Being deeply seen. That's what most people quietly long for. We often imagine love as being understood. Sometimes love begins one step earlier. Being accurately noticed. After she left, he started noticing how rarely anyone asked follow-up questions. How often conversations remained on the surface. How unusual it actually was for someone to remember tiny preferences. Extra lemon in tea. No onions on burgers. The way he rubbed his left shoulder whenever deadlines approached. The songs he skipped because they reminded him of his father. These details seemed insignificant individually. Together, they formed the experience of being known. He began wondering something uncomfortable. Had he known her equally well? Or had she simply known him better? Memory answered before pride could. She knew which grocery aisle he'd disappear into because he always compared coffee prices. She knew he became unusually quiet whenever family holidays approached. She knew he couldn't sleep after difficult conversations. But what had he truly learned about her? Not favorite movies. Not birthday traditions. The deeper things. What made her withdraw? What frightened her? What kind of silence comforted her? And what kind made her feel abandoned? He wasn't sure anymore. That realization hurt in an entirely different way. Sometimes grief isn't about losing another person. Sometimes it's realizing how much more there was to understand. There had been an evening when she looked unusually tired. He'd asked, "Long day?" She smiled. "Yeah." He accepted the answer. Only much later did he remember she'd lost her grandmother earlier that week. She'd returned to work almost immediately. She'd never wanted to burden anyone. Back then, he assumed she was simply exhausted. Now he wondered. Had she quietly hoped someone would ask again? Not because she couldn't speak. Because sometimes pain needs an invitation before it feels safe enough to appear. He remembered another conversation. They were walking home after dinner. She suddenly asked, "What scares you the most?" He laughed. "Spiders." She rolled her eyes. "I'm serious." He shrugged. "I don't know." At the time, he genuinely believed he didn't know. Months later, walking alone through nearly the same street, the answer finally arrived. Being needed frightened him. Not because he disliked love. Because responsibility awakened an old fear of failing someone. somewhere long before meeting her. Perhaps in childhood. Perhaps in earlier relationships. He had learned that disappointing people felt unbearable. Instead of risking disappointment, he unconsciously created distance. Distance protected him. Or at least, it seemed to. Until the distance itself became the loss. That's another thing meaningful relationships expose. Not only who we are, why we became that way. She never tried to become his therapist. She never diagnosed him. She simply asked ordinary questions. Questions he couldn't answer until long after she was gone. In that sense, she accidentally became a mirror. Not the flattering kind. The honest kind. Mirrors don't create anything. They reveal what's already there. One Sunday morning he found an old notebook. Inside were random lists. Vacation ideas. Movies to watch. Restaurants they'd wanted to visit. Near the back, he found something unexpected. A page she'd written while teasing him. Things you don't know about yourself yet. He smiled. Below the title were 5 playful observations. You're kinder than you think. You pretend you don't like compliments, but you secretly do. You always feed birds when nobody is looking. You panic whenever someone you love is hurting. One day you'll realize you're much softer than your image. He laughed quietly. Then stopped. Because every sentence felt painfully accurate. Not because she'd predicted the future. Because she'd noticed a truth he'd been too distracted to notice himself. Identity is an interesting thing. Most of us build it from our own internal narration. I'm this kind of person. I'm not that kind of person. Sometimes someone who loves us gently interrupts those stories. Not by arguing. By observing. You say you're emotionally unavailable. But you stayed awake all night worrying about your brother. You say you don't care what people think. But you apologize 3 times for being 5 minutes late. You say you're cold. But you still stop to help strangers. The people who love us well often recognize contradictions before we do. Not to criticize them. To complete the picture. Weeks after the breakup, he caught himself helping an elderly man carry groceries into an apartment building. As he walked away, he heard her voice inside his memory. You're kinder than you think. He smiled. Not because she was there. Because she had permanently altered the way he interpreted himself. That's one of the quiet gifts certain people leave behind. Even after they're gone. They continue changing the conversation you have with yourself. Eventually he understood something he hadn't recognized while they were together. She hadn't fallen in love with the version of himself he carefully presented. She'd fallen in love with the one that accidentally appeared between the performances. The one who danced badly in the kitchen. Who cried during documentaries about rescue dogs. Who pretended not to care about birthdays but secretly saved every handwritten card. The one who became incredibly gentle whenever someone trusted him enough to be vulnerable. That man had always existed. She didn't create him. She simply saw him first. And perhaps that's why losing her felt so disorienting. He wasn't only grieving the relationship. He was grieving access to the version of himself that seemed easiest to become in her presence. Eventually, he realized something hopeful hidden inside that grief. If she hadn't created those qualities, then they hadn't disappeared with her. The patience, the tenderness, the quiet generosity, the capacity to love deeply. They were never hers to take away. They had always belonged to him. She had simply been the first person to hold up a mirror clear enough for him to recognize them. And once another human being has shown you a truer version of yourself, life quietly changes forever. Because you can spend years pretending to be someone smaller than you are. But after you've seen the person you were always capable of becoming, forgetting that version of yourself becomes almost impossible. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't arrive when someone leaves. It arrives much later. Not during the breakup. Not during the arguments. Not even during the first quiet weekends afterward. It appears on an ordinary evening, when life has already begun looking normal again. That's the night people often mistake for weakness. The night they almost send the message. Most people assume reaching out happens because someone suddenly becomes overwhelmed by love. Real life is rarely that dramatic. More often, it begins with something remarkably ordinary. A familiar song. A restaurant passed on the drive home. A rainy street. A joke no one else would understand. Or simply, a day that went unexpectedly well. One of the least talked about truths about emotional attachment is this. We don't only want to share pain with people we once loved. We want to share joy. Sometimes the strongest urge to reconnect doesn't happen after a terrible day. It happens after a wonderful one. Because happiness instinctively searches for the people who once made it feel complete. That evening started like hundreds before it. Work had gone surprisingly well. A difficult project had finally been approved. His co-workers suggested celebrating. They laughed over dinner. Someone ordered dessert for the table. On the drive home, he felt lighter than he had in months. The city looked unusually peaceful. Traffic moved slowly beneath glowing streetlights. People walked dogs along quiet sidewalks. For a brief moment, life felt uncomplicated. Then almost automatically, his hand reached toward the passenger seat. Not because anything was there. Because for nearly 2 years, that's where his phone usually rested while he called her. He froze. The movement had happened before conscious thought. Body memory. The nervous system often remembers routines long after the mind has accepted they're over. He smiled to himself. Shook his head. Kept driving. But something had shifted. By the time he reached his apartment, the urge hadn't disappeared. It had quietly grown. Inside, everything looked exactly as he'd left it. Keys in the ceramic bowl near the door. Shoes lined neatly against the wall. Kitchen spotless. Living room silent. Months earlier, he had believed silence was what he wanted. Now, on evenings like this, silence sometimes felt strangely unfinished. He placed his phone on the kitchen counter while making tea. Steam curled slowly into the air. Without thinking, he reached for 2 mugs. His hand stopped halfway. He stared at them, then quietly returned one to the cabinet. Grief rarely announces itself with tears. Sometimes, it's putting back a second coffee cup. He carried his tea to the couch. Opened a book. Read the same paragraph 4 times. Nothing stayed in his mind. Instead, memories drifted in without invitation. Not the breakup. Not the arguments. The ordinary things. The way she'd celebrate tiny victories. The way she'd ask, "So, tell me everything." Even when nothing particularly interesting had happened. Especially then. She had a way of making ordinary days feel worth describing. He realized something unexpected. He didn't miss being admired. He missed being witnessed. Those aren't the same thing. Admiration says, "You're impressive." Witnessing says, "I notice your life." One feeds achievement. The other feeds belonging. He had spent months convincing himself he missed the relationship. Tonight, he wondered if what he truly missed was having someone who instinctively cared about the little stories. The co-worker who accidentally spilled coffee. The elderly woman who complimented his jacket. The ridiculous meeting that could have been an email. Tiny fragments. Insignificant to everyone else. Important because they belonged to his day. She had always understood that intimacy isn't built from extraordinary moments. It's built from accumulated ordinary ones. He picked up his phone. Unlocked it. Opened their old conversation. The cursor blinked. Empty. Waiting. How strange. That such a tiny blinking line could contain so much emotional weight. He typed. "Something funny happened today." He stared at the sentence. Deleted it. Started again. Hope you've been doing well. Deleted that too. Then. Nothing. People often imagine indecision as confusion. Sometimes indecision is actually awareness. He wasn't unsure what to say. He was finally asking himself a question he'd avoided for months. Why now? Not. Do I miss her? That answer was obvious. The deeper question was, what am I hoping this message will give me? Closure? Connection? Comfort? Forgiveness? Another chance? The answer kept changing. That's what made it so difficult. Our motivations are rarely singular. Love is rarely singular either. He stood and walked onto the balcony. The air carried the smell of recent rain. Across the street, someone was laughing loudly enough to echo between apartment buildings. A bicycle rolled past. A child chased after it. Life continued. It always does. That's one of grief's most unsettling lessons. The world doesn't pause simply because something meaningful has ended. It keeps moving. Sometimes. Far sooner than we're emotionally prepared for. He remembered a conversation from nearly a year before. They'd been sitting in a small cafe during a thunderstorm. She'd looked out the window and said, I hope if we ever stop talking, it isn't because we stopped caring. At the time, he'd answered casually. Why would that happen? She shrugged. Sometimes people confuse pride with healing. He hadn't understood. Now, standing alone beneath the same kind of rain, those words returned with startling clarity. Sometimes people confuse pride with healing. How many months had he spent believing silence automatically meant growth? Silence can certainly create healing. But silence itself isn't healing. Healing is what happens inside the silence. Without that inner work, quiet simply becomes distance. He returned inside. His phone still rested on the couch. Waiting. He picked it up again. Scrolled upward through old photographs. One caught his attention. She wasn't even looking at the camera. She was laughing at something he'd said. The photo wasn't technically beautiful. Her hair was messy. The lighting was terrible. Someone's thumb partially covered one corner. Yet somehow, it felt more alive than perfectly staged pictures ever do. He realized why. Authenticity leaves different emotional fingerprints than perfection. Perfection impresses memory. Authenticity lives inside it. He whispered almost without realizing. I forgot how happy you looked. Then corrected himself. No. I forgot how happy we looked. That distinction mattered. Memory has a tendency to separate ourselves from our own contribution. He had spent months idealizing her. Now, he remembered they had also created something together. Not flawless. Not permanent. But real. Another thought followed immediately. Equally uncomfortable. If I reach out, which version of her am I expecting? The woman from this photograph? The woman who cried during their final conversation? Or the woman she has become without me? That's one of the hidden dangers of nostalgia. It freezes people inside old chapters. Reality never does. While he had been reconstructing memories, she had continued living, growing, changing, learning. Perhaps she laughed differently now. Perhaps she had new routines, new friends, new dreams. The version of her he missed no longer fully existed. Just as the version of himself she'd known no longer completely existed either. Relationships don't end with two people remaining emotionally frozen. Life keeps editing everyone. He set the phone back down, walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle again, even though he hadn't finished the first cup. Some people pace when they're anxious. Others clean. Others make tea they don't actually want. The body always invents something to do, while the heart negotiates with itself. As the water boiled, he remembered one of the last difficult conversations they'd had. She'd said quietly, I don't want you to text me because you're lonely. He'd frowned. What do you mean? She looked at him for several seconds before answering. I want someone to choose me, not use me as relief. At the time, those words had felt unfair. Tonight, they felt painfully wise. Loneliness is persuasive. It can convince us that reaching out is always an act of love. Sometimes, it's an attempt to regulate our own discomfort. Those aren't the same thing. He asked himself honestly. If she answered right now, what would I actually ask for? He didn't know. And because he didn't know, he finally understood why he shouldn't press send. Not because contacting an old partner is always wrong. Sometimes reconciliation becomes healthy. Sometimes friendships emerge. Sometimes conversations that were impossible months earlier become possible after real growth. But meaningful conversations require clarity. He wasn't clear yet. He wanted relief. Relief isn't a foundation for reconnection. He looked again at the unfinished message. Then selected every word. Deleted it. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Simply. Quietly. For the first time, deleting the message didn't feel like losing an opportunity. It felt like respecting both of them. There was another realization hiding beneath that decision. He hadn't almost reached out because she had suddenly become more important. She had always been important. He almost reached out because he had finally become capable of asking himself the questions he couldn't face while they were together. That realization softened something inside him. Growth rarely announces itself with confidence. Sometimes, it looks like choosing not to satisfy an immediate emotional impulse. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. He carried the second cup of tea back to the balcony. The rain had stopped. Clouds slowly drifted apart. A few stars became visible between buildings. He thought about all the nights she'd once occupied his thoughts. The nights he believed forgetting someone was the goal. Now, he wasn't so sure. Perhaps healing isn't forgetting. Perhaps it's remembering someone without needing to interrupt their life to soothe your own emotions. He smiled gently. Not because he no longer loved her. Perhaps some part of him always would. But because love itself had changed. It no longer demanded immediate action. It no longer insisted on being answered. It had become quieter. More spacious. Less about possession. More about gratitude. The phone remained inside on the table. Silent. No message sent. No dramatic reunion. No final goodbye. Just one ordinary night, during which a man almost reached for someone he had once loved, and instead reached a deeper understanding of himself. Because sometimes the most important message we never send isn't the one that changes another person's life. It's the one that quietly proves our own heart has finally learned the difference between missing someone and being truly ready to meet them again, long after the relationship has ended. People often ask themselves the wrong question. Why can't I forget her? But memory is rarely the real mystery. The more interesting question is, why did she become the person my mind keeps returning to whenever life changes? Because not everyone we love becomes an emotional landmark. Some relationships become memories. Others become reference points. There is a difference. A memory belongs to the past. A landmark quietly follows you into the future. It becomes something your mind unconsciously measures new experiences against. Not because you're trying to compare. Because the brain naturally organizes life through emotional significance. This isn't about obsession. Nor is it proof that someone was your only chance at love. It's something much more ordinary. And much more profound. Human beings remember emotionally meaningful relationships the way travelers remember certain places. Not every city changes you. Not every road stays with you. But occasionally, you stand somewhere that quietly rearranges the way you understand yourself. Years later, you may not remember every conversation that happened there. You may forget what you wore, what you ordered, even the weather. but you remember how you became while you were there. Relationships can work the same way. He realized this almost 2 years after she left. He wasn't thinking about her every day anymore. In fact, there were entire weeks when she never crossed his mind. Life had grown fuller. Work had changed. He'd moved into a different apartment, made new friends, learned to cook meals he used to order, started waking earlier. Some wounds had quietly become scars. Not invisible, just no longer bleeding. Then one Saturday morning, he walked through a local farmer's market. Fresh flowers lined one side of the street. Children ran between food stalls. Someone played an old jazz song from a portable speaker. He stopped to buy peaches. The elderly woman selling them smiled. "They're sweetest if you wait until tomorrow." He thanked her, walked away, and suddenly, without warning, he wondered what kind of fruit she would have chosen. Not because peaches reminded him of her. Nothing in particular did. It was the habit of wanting to know another person's small opinion. The question appeared, then disappeared. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Yet those 5 seconds fascinated him. She hadn't interrupted his day. His mind had simply used her as an old reference point. Almost like saying, "I remember what it felt like to experience ordinary moments alongside someone who noticed everything." The brain stores emotionally significant relationships differently than casual acquaintances. Psychologists sometimes describe memory as being strengthened by emotional relevance rather than by frequency alone. We don't remember every Tuesday. We remember Tuesdays that quietly change the story we tell ourselves. That's why emotional landmarks are often created through surprisingly ordinary experiences. Not grand vacations. Not expensive anniversaries. Not dramatic declarations of love. Instead, small repetitions. Morning coffee. Weekly grocery shopping. Late-night conversations after difficult days. Driving without music. Walking through bookstores. Learning how another person folds laundry. Laughing because both of you reached for the same spoon. Tiny moments. Repeated hundreds of times. Eventually, they stop being separate memories. They become emotional architecture. One afternoon, he visited a bookstore they'd once loved. Not intentionally. He simply happened to be nearby. The layout had changed. New shelves. Different lighting. The cafe had expanded into what used to be the history section. Everything looked unfamiliar. Yet, his feet still instinctively walked toward the corner where she'd always browsed psychology books. He stopped halfway, smiled to himself. How strange that his body remembered a building that no longer existed. That's another characteristic of emotional landmarks. They aren't preserved exactly as they were. They're preserved as your nervous system experienced them. Not objective reality. Subjective meaning. He remembered something she'd once said while standing in that exact corner. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I think people spend their whole lives trying to be understood, when they first need to understand themselves." At the time, he nodded politely. It sounded thoughtful. Months later, those words became one of the central ideas that shaped his healing. The conversation hadn't changed. He had. Meaning often arrives late. Sometimes years late. Certain people become emotional landmarks because they say something our future self eventually grows into. It's similar to planting a seed. Nothing appears immediately. Then one day, almost unexpectedly, an entire tree exists where a single sentence once landed. He sat in the cafe with a cup of coffee. Nearby, a young couple quietly debated which novel to buy. The woman laughed. The man insisted she'd enjoy one author more than another. It reminded him less of his own relationship, and more of the emotional atmosphere they'd created. That's an important distinction. For a long time, he thought he missed her specifically. Gradually, He realized he also missed the emotional environment they had built together. Curiosity, safety, playfulness, being able to ask strange questions without embarrassment, feeling seen on ordinary days. Those qualities mattered even more than specific memories. Psychologically, this makes sense. The nervous system doesn't merely remember people. It remembers states. Who helped you feel calm? Who made you feel anxious? Who encouraged exploration? Who required self-protection? The person becomes linked with the emotional state. Over time, that state itself becomes the landmark. One evening, he attended a colleague's engagement party. Everyone celebrated loudly. Champagne glasses clinked. Music filled the room. Someone asked him, "So, what do you think makes a relationship actually last?" Months earlier, he probably would have answered differently. Now he paused. "I think," he began slowly, "it's when two people make each other feel more like themselves instead of less." The table became quiet. He hadn't planned that answer. It simply appeared. Later that night, driving home, he realized where the thought had come from. Not from a podcast. Not from a book. From living through the relationship. She had become part of the framework through which he understood love itself. That's what emotional landmarks do. They quietly reorganize your definitions. Before meeting her, he believed love meant compatibility. After knowing her, he understood that compatibility mattered. But emotional safety mattered just as much. Before meeting her, he believed independence meant needing no one. Afterward, he discovered that healthy independence means remaining yourself while deeply connected. Before meeting her, he thought vulnerability meant revealing painful stories. Now he knew vulnerability often looks much smaller. Admitting you're afraid. Saying, "I don't know." Asking, "Can we talk?" Telling someone, "I need you." Those ideas remained, even though the relationship didn't. Perhaps that was the point. We often assume the purpose of every meaningful relationship is permanence. Life doesn't always work that way. Some people stay. Others teach. Sometimes they do both. Sometimes they don't. Either way, their influence continues. Months later, he met someone new. She was kind, funny, emotionally available. The first few dates went well. One evening, she asked, "What did your last relationship teach you?" Years earlier, that question would have filled him with regret. This time, he answered differently. "It taught me that I don't want to win arguments anymore." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "I think I used to believe being right protected me. And now I think understanding each other protects the relationship much better." She smiled softly. "I like that answer." Driving home, he realized something surprising. He hadn't compared the two women. He had carried wisdom from one relationship into another. That's what healthy remembrance looks like. An emotional landmark shouldn't become a prison. It should become a compass. The purpose isn't to endlessly search for someone identical. No two people ever are. The purpose is recognizing what kind of emotional life allows you to become your healthiest self. Many people fear that remembering someone deeply means they'll never fully move on. The opposite can also be true. Sometimes remembering honestly is exactly what allows movement. Because memory becomes less about reclaiming the past and more about integrating its lessons. He no longer wanted to recreate their relationship. He simply wanted to continue becoming the man it had helped reveal. One afternoon, while cleaning old storage boxes, he found a folded receipt. Coffee, 2 pastries, a bookstore purchase. Nothing extraordinary. No emotional letter. No photograph. Just a receipt. The ink had almost disappeared. He smiled, then placed it gently back inside the box. Not because he couldn't let go, because he no longer needed to. There was a quiet peace in allowing certain objects to exist without assigning them impossible meaning. Healing had changed the role memory played. Once, every reminder reopened a wound. Now, it opened gratitude. That transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly, like daylight replacing darkness. You rarely notice the exact moment it occurs. You simply look around one morning and realize you can breathe differently. Near the end of that year, he returned to the park where they'd often walked together. Autumn leaves covered the paths. Parents pushed strollers. An elderly couple fed ducks by the pond. Everything looked both familiar and entirely new. He sat on the same bench they'd once shared. Not because he expected anything to happen, simply because it happened to be empty. The silence felt comfortable. No longing. No dramatic sadness. Just appreciation. He finally understood why certain people become emotional landmarks. Not because they were perfect. Not because the relationship was perfect. Not because life stopped after they left. They become landmarks because they quietly mark the place where a version of you first began to wake up. You don't keep returning because you're trapped. You return because that's where part of your emotional map was drawn. Just as travelers sometimes revisit the city where they first learned courage. Or artists revisit the cafe where inspiration first arrived. The heart occasionally revisits people who changed its internal landscape. Not to live there forever. Simply to remember the direction. Because the healthiest emotional landmarks don't pull you backward. They orient you forward. They remind you who you became. What you learned. What kind of love expanded you instead of shrinking you. And perhaps that's the deepest reason some women are never truly forgotten. Not because they remain at the center of your life, but because long after the relationship ends, they remain quietly woven into the map that helps you find your way through the rest of it. In the end, it was never about feminine energy. Not in the way social media often describes it. Not as mystery. Not as strategy. Not as silence designed to make someone chase. Not as emotional games disguised as self-worth. The woman he couldn't dominate wasn't trying to dominate him either. That was the part he understood last. For a long time, he believed relationships were built around influence. Who apologized first? Who texted first? Who cared more? Who needed less? Who had the emotional advantage? Without realizing it, he had treated love like a negotiation. Every disagreement became a balance of power. Every vulnerable moment carried invisible calculations. If I say this, will she have more control? If I admit I miss her, will I lose mine? If I stay quiet, will she come closer? None of these questions sounded manipulative inside his own mind. They sounded practical, protective, reasonable. Because fear often disguises itself as logic. Looking back, he could finally see something painful. She had almost never participated in those silent competitions. Whenever he pulled away, she didn't immediately pull harder. She reached once, sometimes twice. Then she simply became honest. Not because she wanted him to lose, because she refused to lose herself. There is an enormous difference. One evening, months after everything had ended, he found himself watching an elderly couple at a neighborhood cafe. The woman accidentally knocked over her glass of water. The man laughed. Without saying a word, he grabbed extra napkins. She smiled, rolled her eyes. "I'm hopeless," he answered softly. "No, you're human." The exchange lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Yet it stayed with him all afternoon. No one was keeping score. No one needed to be right. No one defended themselves. There was no invisible struggle for emotional superiority. Just two people responding to each other. It looked peaceful. And suddenly, he realized something uncomfortable. He had once mistaken peace for weakness. If someone didn't argue, he assumed they didn't care. If someone didn't demand, he assumed they didn't need him. If someone accepted his decision, he assumed they weren't deeply affected. But emotional maturity often looks surprisingly quiet. It doesn't always protest. Sometimes, it simply tells the truth. He remembered one of their last conversations. I can't keep chasing someone who keeps running. She hadn't cried. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened to leave. She simply said, I deserve a relationship where I don't have to convince someone to stay emotionally present. At the time, he interpreted her calmness as detachment. Now, he understood it had required tremendous courage. Because calm isn't always the absence of feeling. Sometimes, it's feeling everything while refusing to abandon your dignity. That was the energy he couldn't dominate. Not because it was mysterious, because it wasn't participating in the same game. Psychologists sometimes describe this as differentiation. The ability to stay emotionally connected, without surrendering your own identity. It means saying, I love you, but I won't become someone else to keep you. Many people misunderstand this. They think healthy boundaries push love away. In reality, healthy boundaries reveal whether love can survive without control. His relationship had quietly exposed something about himself. Whenever he felt uncertain, he reached for control. Not intentionally, almost automatically. If conversations became emotionally uncomfortable, he withdrew. If vulnerability felt dangerous, he intellectualized. If conflict appeared, he solved practical problems while avoiding emotional ones. From the outside, it looked calm. Inside, it was fear. Fear often wears impressive disguises. Efficiency, logic, independence, busyness, perfection. But underneath, fear is still fear. One afternoon, he met an old friend for lunch. Someone who had known him long before this relationship. After talking for nearly an hour, his friend suddenly asked, Can I tell you something? Sure. I think you always believed people had to earn closeness with you. He frowned. What do you mean? His friend stirred his coffee before answering. You trusted people after they proved themselves. Isn't that normal? To a point. But she wasn't asking to earn closeness. She was asking you to share it. The sentence landed heavily. He had never considered the difference. Many of us confuse trust with emotional distance. We believe love becomes safer if another person reaches us first. If they prove enough, stay enough, wait enough. Eventually, they deserve the version of us we're protecting. But genuine intimacy doesn't work that way. It requires mutual risk. She had taken hers. Again, and again, and again. Eventually, she stopped asking him to meet her halfway. Not because she no longer loved him. Because she realized she couldn't walk both sides of the bridge. That image stayed with him for days. One person cannot build an entire relationship alone. Eventually, they become exhausted. Not from loving, from carrying. Several weeks later, he volunteered at a community event organized by work. Nothing extraordinary. Packing donated food. Loading boxes. Helping elderly residents carry groceries. At one point, he watched a young volunteer helping an older woman cross uneven pavement. She didn't rush. She didn't make a show of helping. She simply adjusted her pace. Matched the older woman's rhythm. Without impatience. Without needing recognition. He noticed something. Strength often looks remarkably gentle. Not loud. Not forceful. Not dominating. Simply present. That observation reminded him of her again. Not because she had been perfect. She wasn't. They had both made mistakes. She became frustrated, sometimes defensive, sometimes emotionally overwhelmed. She had her own wounds, her own fears, her own blind spots. But beneath all of that, there had always been one consistent quality. She never tried to become bigger than him. She simply refused to become smaller than herself. Those are entirely different things. There is a popular misunderstanding that emotionally secure people are impossible to hurt. Reality is almost the opposite. Secure people often feel pain very deeply. They simply don't organize their lives around preventing every possible hurt. Instead, they organize their lives around remaining honest despite it. That honesty had frightened him, because honesty leaves nowhere to hide. She would say things like, "I miss you," not to manipulate, simply because she did. She would admit, "I'm scared," without pretending not to be. She would ask, "Are we okay?" instead of silently pretending everything was fine. At the time, he interpreted those moments as emotional dependence. Years later, he recognized them as emotional courage, the ability to name reality before certainty exists. One rainy Sunday, while cleaning old files from his laptop, he discovered a folder of forgotten videos. Tiny clips. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Nothing important. She laughing because he burned pancakes. Both of them getting lost during a road trip. A terrible attempt at dancing in the kitchen while pasta boiled over. He watched them quietly. Something struck him immediately. Neither of them looked impressive. Neither was trying to appear attractive. No one performed for the camera. They looked safe. Psychologists often describe authenticity as behaving similarly whether someone is watching or not. He realized something heartbreaking. The happiest moments in those videos weren't created because they had everything figured out. They existed because neither person was trying to win. The relationship deteriorated later, when fear gradually replaced curiosity, when protection replaced openness, when assumptions replaced questions, when silence replaced honesty. Not overnight. Almost invisibly. That's how most relationships change. Not through one catastrophic mistake. Through hundreds of tiny emotional withdrawals. One evening, he sat alone with his journal, a habit he had started months after the breakup. At the top of the page he wrote, "What kind of partner do I want to become?" Not, "What kind of partner do I want to find?" The distinction mattered. For nearly an hour, he wrote, "I want to stay present during uncomfortable conversations. I want to ask questions before making assumptions. I want to admit fear before it becomes distance. I want to repair instead of retreat. I want someone to feel emotionally safe with me." When he finished, he noticed something unexpected. Very few items described another person. Almost every sentence described himself. That may be one of adulthood's quietest transformations. Eventually, love stops being a search for the right person, and slowly becomes a practice of becoming the right partner. Months later, while walking home after sunset, he passed the same park where so much of his healing had unfolded. Children had gone home. The paths were quiet. Wind moved softly through the trees. He sat on the familiar bench. Not because he missed the past, because it had become a place where he could hear himself think. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, he mentally thanked her. Not for leaving, not for hurting, not for the ending. He thanked her for something much quieter, for never asking him to become someone he wasn't. She had simply hoped he would stop hiding the person he already was. There is a profound difference. Control changes behavior. Love reveals character. Control says, "Become who I need." Love asks, "Can you safely become more of yourself here?" That question echoed through everything he had learned. Perhaps the woman he couldn't dominate had never possessed extraordinary feminine energy at all. Perhaps she simply possessed emotional integrity. She said yes when she meant yes. No when she meant no. She reached when she wanted connection. She stepped back when connection became one-sided. She grieved honestly. She healed honestly. She loved honestly. There was nothing mysterious about it. Only something increasingly rare. Congruence. Her inner world gradually matched her outer actions. That consistency became unforgettable. Because human beings instinctively relax around people whose words and behavior align. Years later, if someone asked him what made her impossible to forget, his answer would sound very different than it once would have. Not her beauty. Not the chemistry. Not the excitement. Not even the love. He would simply say, "She was the first person who showed me that intimacy isn't about winning. It's about two people putting down their armor long enough to truly meet." And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath every story like this. The feminine energy that leaves the deepest impression isn't the one that makes a man chase. It isn't the one that creates confusion. It isn't the one that withholds affection to gain power. The energy that remains unforgettable is the quiet confidence of someone who refuses to manipulate love. Because she understands that real connection cannot be negotiated into existence. It can only be chosen. Again and again. By two people willing to meet each other without masks. In the end, that was the lesson he carried long after her name became just another chapter in his history. Some people leave your life. Some remain in your memory. But the rare ones, the ones who quietly transform the way you understand love, never become chains that hold you to the past. They become mirrors, not reflecting who you used to be, but gently reminding you of the person you are still capable of becoming. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The woman he thought he couldn't dominate had never been trying to win. She had simply been trying to love. And once he finally understood the difference, he no longer measured relationships by who stayed or who left. He measured them by a far quieter question: who helped me become more fully myself, while giving me the freedom to help them become more fully themselves, too? That is the kind of love that doesn't rely on power. It relies on presence. And presence is something no one can ever force. Only offer. Only receive. Only choose.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.